Today on Blue 58, the Packers have two young standout tight ends. Given what we know about tight end development, where do they stand heading into their second season?
Blue 58!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Blue 58, the one and only podcast of thepowersweep.com. I'm your host, John Meerdink, and I am happy to be with you here for another episode, in no small part because we're going to spend most of it talking about tight ends. But first, we're going to talk about my other big love in football, uniforms. I think we're going to be seeing an interesting Packers alternate uniform in the next year or so, and I'm inspired to that conclusion because of what the Minnesota Vikings unveiled this week. Yes, two episodes in a row we're going to be talking about the Minnesota Vikings, but they unveiled an all-white alternate uniform, white helmet, white jersey, white pants. I think we're going to see something similar to that coming in Green Bay. Earlier this offseason, Paul Lucas of UniWatch, formerly of UniWatch, he's now retired. All the kudos to him. We should probably do a longer thing about his influence on this show and things that I've written. But that's for another day. He confirmed earlier this offseason, reported earlier this offseason that the Packers have a white alternate helmet in the works. The NFL recently relaxed what they called their one shell rule. Teams can now use an alternate helmet if they would like. And we are seeing already a lot of teams begin to adopt alternate uniforms based on that additional shell for their helmets. Philadelphia Eagles have their all-black uniform. The Carolina Panthers unveiled a black helmet last year. The Vikings now have their white helmet and their uniform that goes with it. The Houston Texans unveiled their in the NBA they call it their City Connect uniform. The NFL, some teams I think are headed that direction with stuff like that. I think we're going to see a proliferation of alternate uniforms based around these alternate helmets, and the Vikings are headed that direction. But if the rumors are true, I think that we're going to see a Packers uniform that's very similar to what we see from the Vikings, if only because the white helmet really only goes with the uniform the Packers already have, their white no color rush uniforms that were unveiled a few years ago. You're not going to put the white helmet with their green home uniforms. You're not going to put it with the white road uniforms that have the gold pants because, well, why would you? It only really makes sense to put it with a white alternate, and the Packers already have a white uniform in the works. If that is indeed what happens, I would suspect we get confirmation of it perhaps before the end of this year, but certainly early next year, with the final look coming together around the NFL draft. A lot of uniform changes are announced around the NFL draft, and with the NFL draft being in Green Bay next year, I think it just makes sense. You're going to see a lot of interesting stuff around the draft going on in Green Bay, and if the Packers can add a little bit of buzz and get a little bit of attention toward an alternate uniform, I think that's something that they would do. And if the Packers are going to jump on a bandwagon where they're doing what other teams in the league are doing, you can almost count on them to do it in the most Packers way possible. They're not going to do a loud, wild, crazy uniform. They're going to do something that's pretty reserved. The all whites look pretty good, and adding the white helmet to the already white uniform and white pants, it looks pretty good to me. And as I wrote at thepowersweep.com, if and when this happens, we are obligated to call them their white cheddar uniforms. I just want to get ahead of that. I want to say it right now. If and when it happens, is white cheddar in Green Bay. It's a way better name than the Vikings Winter Warrior uniforms, which is what they're calling their all-white alternates, which doesn't make any sense at all because they don't play it outside. But white cheddar makes sense in Green Bay. Packers, cheeseheads, all-white uniform, white cheddar. If it's coming to Green Bay, let's at least get the nickname right for that alternate uniform. All right, tight ends. Throughout this offseason so far, through our post-draft offseason stuff, I've been trying to do a little bit of a research project related to every position on the roster. We've done a little bit of stuff on quarterback, but we've dived deep on running backs, and we did wide receivers in the last episode. We've done a little bit of stuff on the defensive line. Today it's time to talk about tight ends. And fortunately, we've started a bit of a longer-running research project on tight ends about a year ago now. Last July, we started looking at tight end development curves, and this is something that I want to maintain going forward. This is something I want to do with as many of these off-season research projects as I can, just continue to add data to them long term and help us continue to contextualize what we're seeing about the Packers and the NFL as a whole. This is the only NFL-wide one I've got going right now, but I think it does give us a little bit of insight both into tight end development at a league perspective and just at the position in general, and with the Packers specifically because they've got two noteworthy young tight ends. So here's the project. Last year, we were trying to answer the question, when do we think the Packers' young tight ends are going to essentially develop into the player they're going to become? When does most tight end development really happen? And to do that, we came up with a study that we're going to be able to continue to add data to long term. We set some thresholds for what we wanted to look at in terms of tight ends, and we're going to look at them based on a couple different Pro Football Focus grading numbers over the course of their careers. But we come up with our sample size by looking at tight ends drafted in the top 100 picks since 2011. They need to have played at least 35 games across 4 seasons to give us a good amount of data to work with, but we're looking at how they developed in a few key areas. We're looking at their overall offensive grade from Pro Football Focus, their receiving grade, and their run blocking grade, figuring that gives us a pretty good glimpse at what their overall development could look like. Just a couple explanatory things. Why do we look at 2011 to present? Well, for one, 2011 was when the most influential collective bargaining agreement came into place. Prior to 2011, rookie contracts could be huge. We're trying to compare apples to apples as much as we can. That is the firmest line of demarcation between what you could call the old NFL and the new NFL. I think that from a player development standpoint, that's a good place to draw the line. We're looking for guys that have played at least 4 seasons, so our data sample currently goes from 2011 to 2020 because we want to get a look at their entire rookie contract and see how they developed over the course of that rookie season. We're also looking at guys that were only drafted in the top 100 because we want to see, make sure that they, we're talking about guys who have a real chance of making the roster, not just flyer guys, and guys that played at least 35 games across 4 seasons. So if you didn't play 35 games, you didn't develop, we're just looking for guys that actually did develop. So we wanted to see if they played a significant amount of time across their rookie contract. So prior to this season, we had about 40 guys. For the 2020 class, we add in two more in Cole Kmet and Josiah DeGuara. So those are the only guys from the 2020 class that were drafted in the top 100. And looking back at the data, I might have to go back and see if we actually did look at the top 100 for all of these classes, because some of them looks like we had a ton of guys go in the top 100. There's like 15 guys from the 2018 class or something like that. So maybe I just didn't break things up quite right, or I got a couple draft classes mixed in there. But I think this is all top 100 guys. In any case, we add to our data sample this year Cole Kmet and Josiah DeGuara, both of whom met the 35 games and 4 years threshold from the 2020 draft class, both being drafted in the top 100. Had a couple guys that just missed it, went like 101 and 105. But they don't make the sample, so we don't include them in our development timeline here. Here's what we know, and this is kind of recapping stuff from about a year ago, but in case you've forgotten, on average, most of the tight end development takes place between years 1 and 2, not years 2 and 3 or 3 to 4. The jump from year 1 to year 2 is when we see the biggest increase in overall Pro Football Focus grade. So on average, guys increase their overall Pro Football Focus grade by 3.55 points from year 1 to year 2. Their receiving grade goes up by 3.45%, or not percent, 3.45 points, and their run blocking grade goes up by 5.9 points on average. That's the biggest jumps. Those are all the biggest jumps among any average increase among those 3 categories from any year 1 to year 2, 2 to 3, or 3 to 4. Even the year 1 to 4 jumps are smaller on average than just year 1 to year 2. So at least based on this data, most of the tight end development stuff that we see happens from the first year to the second year. That's good news in a vacuum, as we said last year, for the Packers tight ends, even heading into the season, and it's even better news now that we've seen them in the course of a season. So let's break down the numbers a little bit further. On average, The tight end that's in our sample had a year one offensive grade of 63.7. The median grade was 62.8, the low was 42.9, and the high was 89. Luke Musgrave's year one grade was 68.1, and Tucker Kraft's year one grade was 60.4. Musgrave already grades out ahead of the average tight end in terms of overall grade from Pro Football Focus, and Tucker Kraft is just a hair below both the average and the median. If both of them improve by what we typically see by about 3 points in their Pro Football Focus grade, both of them will be well ahead of where the year two line usually is. Musgrave actually is only about 0.2 of a point below where the year two grade typically was in year one. Kraft, a little bit lower than that. The median or the average grade is 68.3, so 60.4. He'd have to do some significant improvement to jump past there, but he's right in line there. He's real close to the average. Receiving grade, even more promising. The average grade was 63.3 or 63.4, depending how you grade. Musgrave's grade was 69.6 and Kraft's was 65.1, so both of them, again, above average. The run blocking grade, this is typically where we see rookie tight ends be the weakest, and true to form, I think this is where Musgrave and Kraft fit the most closely with their scouting reports. Musgrave was, the knocks on him as a blocker in college were pretty significant, much more of a receiving tight end in college than a blocker, than an inline guy. And true to form, he grades out below average here. The average grade here is 63.1 in year one. Musgrave was at 59.3. Kraft was at 48.7, fitting with the scouting report generally of him maybe having some difficulty jumping from being at South Dakota State to the NFL. Both of them played true to form. But overall here, I think you should be really encouraged about where both Musgrave and Kraft ended their rookie seasons, because it looks like they are not just on track for where we see most rookie players, but ahead of the curve. And if they take an average jump next year, Musgrave will be even further ahead of the curve, and Kraft will be right in line, maybe a little bit lower with what we expect from most players. I don't have the data on Kraft broken down by like parts of the season, but I suspect that he'd be right there with Musgrave, maybe even a little bit ahead. If we just looked at his Pro Football Focus grades in the second half of the season, he'd probably grade out ahead of a lot of these rookie tight ends, because I think down the stretch he was a much different player than he was early in the season. And I think this is really exciting for the Packers fans in general and tight end enthusiasts like myself, because I think we're seeing a really good chance of having not just one of the best tight ends of the 20th century or since the year 2000 on the roster right now, but to potentially the best two. These could be the two best tight ends we've seen from the Packers since the year 2000 and maybe even before then. They are well on their way to being one of the best, or both some of the best tight ends we've seen in green and gold in a long time, and we'll put a little bit more context to that here in a second. But I think we have every reason to be really encouraged about what we're seeing from these young Packers players right now. And Musgrave and Kraft are well on their way to doing some really exciting things in Green Bay. And taking an even bigger step forward this next season should put them among the better performing tight ends in the NFL at their age. Certainly, according to what we've seen so far, they appear to be ahead of the curve, and that is really exciting. I want to give one more shout out to our Patreon, patreon.com/thepowersweep, and our Substack, thepowersweep.substack.com. You can choose to support for any dollar amount at Patreon if you would like. There's a bunch of different giving thresholds there, but you just help us keep the lights on here and keep the whole show rolling here. It takes some money to do this, and we appreciate everybody who chooses to chip in, and we love to give back as well. So if you choose to support at Patreon or on Substack, we'd love to give back to you. First and foremost in the form of our great community on the Power Sweeps Discord server, but also in the form of some merch that can come your way thanks to Patreon's fulfillment stuff. And if you choose to support through Substack because you don't want to go through Patreon or whatever, we'll make sure that you get taken care of as well. We want to thank you for thanking us for giving you Packers content. And just however we can do that, through bonus content, through stuff like that, we want to do that. Just today, in fact, as I record this, posted a new Ask Me Anything. I got a lot of good questions from Discord users all over the world, and took your questions on everything and everything. Which Packers player do you think is the best hugger was one of the questions we dealt with this time around. Won't give away the answer here, but if that intrigues you at all, there's also answers in there about TV shows, football research, property records, which Packers wide receiver would make the best defensive back, all sorts of fun stuff. So check it out, access the bonus content, get thanked for your contributions here, and join in with our Discord server and hang out with Packers fans from all over the world. All right, I gave an allusion there toward Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft being some of the best young tight ends, maybe even the best tight ends we've seen in recent Packers history. I know the game has changed, and I know that things are not quite the same as they were 15, 20 years ago, but I think we've got good reason to believe that both Musgrave and Kraft are well on their way to being some of the best tight ends we've seen since the year 2000. We just did a project like this on wide receivers, comparing the Packers' 6 young wide receivers in Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Reed, Wicks, and Melton, to some of the greats that came before them, Jordy Nelson, Devontae Adams. Where were they at their point or at this point in their careers in terms of yards? And it's not a perfect metric, but looking at where Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft are in terms of the yards that they've accumulated receiving to this point in their NFL careers, comparing that to every tight end drafted in the top 100 since 2000, you've got a lot more reason to be optimistic. Through 11 games, which is the total that Luke Musgrave played last regular season before rupturing his spleen, through 11 games, nobody that the Packers have drafted at tight end accumulated as many yards as Luke Musgrave did. It's just a simple fact. The other draft picks we're talking about is Bubba Franks, Jermichael Finley, Richard Rodgers, Jace Sternberger, and Josiah DeGuara, I guess, as well as Tucker Kraft as well. But through 11 games, 352 yards from Musgrave is the best from any of those tight ends the Packers have drafted. Bubba Franks had 296 as a second place there, and then Richard Rodgers, a distant third, with 137. The other tight ends on the roster took a lot longer to blossom, if they blossomed at all. Jace Sternberger and Richard Rodgers were never particularly dangerous as receivers, so they took a lot longer to really get going, and really never did in Sternberger's case. But Jermichael Finley didn't really take off until well into his second and even his third year. His career, of course, cut short by the neck injury that he had in 2013. But he ends up being the most productive tight end of the 20th century, 21st century, for the time that he played. When he had to stop, he had 2,785 yards, which is 400 more than Bubba Franks ended up with in his career. And he played about 40 fewer games than Franks did. So for Finley, by far the gold standard among tight end productivity. But through 11 games, Luke Musgrave comfortably ahead of where Finley was at the same point in his career. Tucker Kraft played all 17 games in the regular season last year and is behind only Bubba Franks in terms of overall stats to that point in their respective career. 355 yards for Kraft is just behind Franks, who had 408 through his first 17 career games. Again, the development was there last season. The stats seem to be there for both Musgrave and Kraft to be two of the best tight ends we've seen in Green Bay this century, certainly in the last 25 years. They are well on their way. And to kind of put a bow on both this and the wide receiver discussion we had in the last episode, the foundation is just remarkable in Green Bay right now. The amount of talent the Packers have in terms of pass catchers is, I think, unprecedented. In the wide receiver episode, we talked about that Sports Illustrated cover. Greg Jennings, James Jones, Jordy Nelson, Randall Cobb, Donald Driver, Jermichael Finley. That's 6 really great options. And I'm not saying that any of the Packers' options right now are as good as any of those guys, because they aren't as decorated as any of those guys. I'll go, the 2011 cover was Randall Cobb's rookie year. Jaden Reed had a better rookie year, I think, than Randall Cobb did. At least in the conversation, statistically, it was better. But I think if you look at the depth the Packers have right now, Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks, Bo Melton, Luke Musgrave, Tucker Kraft, Malik Heath. I mean, that's 8 good options. It's a wealth of talent. Even without making historical comparisons to what's come before, you've got 8 really, really good options here for the Packers, however they end up developing. And most likely what's going to end up happening is all 8 of these guys won't end up being long-term players, guys the Packers want to keep around long-term. But if one of your 2 tight ends turns out to be a long-term keeper, and 2 of your 6 receivers turn out to be long-term keepers, you're still so far ahead of the game that it's not even funny. It just from a roster building perspective, if it ends up working out, even at that rate, 3 of the 8 guys end up being long-term keepers, you're still doing really, really well. And then what can you do? You can just keep adding in more talent. You add in more up-and-coming guys, and you hope a few more of those guys hit, and the machine just continues to churn. This is something the Packers really kind of failed to do in the latter portion of Aaron Rodgers' career. They just basically stopped adding high-end receiver talent or high-end tight end talent after 2014. There was really never another draft pick that hit to a significant degree. Marquez Valdes-Scantling is your best one, 2014 to 22, or 15 to 22 after Devontae Adams. That's it. That's as good as it gets. And I think the Packers suffered for it down the stretch in Rodgers' career. We're a long way from being in that conversation, but right now they've got a good chance of a lot of things working out pretty well for them. If you don't have to have everybody hit to have a successful offense, but you increase your odds of some of those guys hitting by having this many options out there. And I think Packers fans should be nothing but encouraged as they look at where the Packers skill position players are heading into the 2024 season. If you are excited, it's not just being a homer. If you're looking forward to what's coming out with the Packers this year, or what their offense is going to look like, or who could explode or really take a leap this year, it's not just you looking at this with green and gold glasses on. There's legitimate reason to think that the Packers are on track to having a dynamic group of pass catchers on their offense. The numbers prove it with Musgrave and Kraft's development. The numbers show it with how the young receivers stack up against some of the greats in recent Packers history. There is talent here. It's not just reading scouting reports. It's not just looking at RAS scores. They are putting up numbers that put them in elite company historically, that put them on the development timeline of the better tight ends that we've seen. They look good. They're playing well. If they can continue to put one foot in front of the other as a growing prospect, the sky really is the limit. There is a lot of reason to be optimistic here. And maybe not just even optimistic, but just realistic about what the Packers could achieve. They can achieve some really big things, and they've got the pieces in place to do it. If you're excited, you have good reason to be. If you're not, you probably should be. That's all I've got for you in this episode of Blue 58. I appreciate you tuning in. I'd appreciate it even more if you'd take a second and share this episode with someone you think would enjoy it. Going to help more people find the show and get more people involved in this conversation you and I are having about the Green Bay Packers, which in turn is going to help all of us, me included, become smarter Packers fans. And as I always say, smarter Packers fans are better Packers fans, and better Packers fans are what we all want to be. I'm your host, John Meerdink. We'll see you next time on Blue 58.